I mean, just talking about this, Miatta, and this rise of far-right extremism, we've seen attacks across Europe. You know, you go back to 2011 with Anders Breivik, of course, and recently, not just on the Muslim community, but at synagogues and the Jewish community. It really is a concern, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and it's, you know, it's people are getting to grips and starting to understand that this is now a thing. And to be fair to the intelligence forces, you know, undercover policing, trying to kind of expose this, that is happening. But it's really, really worrying. And for me, you know, one of the things that we need to do is call it out, because I think some of the mild racism almost gives an excuse for people to believe that they can act like this without impunity. And you absolutely need to, we need to close it down, we need to quash it, because it's really, you know, as an ethnic minority, it is incredibly terrifying.
Do you think we've been guilty of perhaps sleeping on far-right extremism because of so many concerns of other forms of extremism, which we've had very physical, you know, impact of? We've had attacks, haven't we, that we therefore have perhaps not noticed the rise of far-right extremism?
So I don't think there's been as much of a spotlight on it. So it's been growing for a while, and actually we're only just started to talk about it. And I would argue that, yes, we're a far more diverse society in parts, but, you know, there is a form of kind of xenophobia and racism that's rising, that's fueling the far right. And the more, you know, for me, the more you mainstream any of that, the more we say some forms of mild racism are OK, the more you give them legitimacy. And at this point, you have to say it is absolutely wrong. We need to be clear that this is happening, it's real, it's in our communities, and we need to give it as much attention as we've given other forms of terrorism.
I mean, it's one of the key differences here in Britain is that anybody from whichever side of the extremism line you're on can't get easy access to guns here, and I often wonder if that was an easy option, what we could be faced with here in Britain, and I think that is one saving grace for us here.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true, but at the same time, it doesn't stop knife attacks,
of course it does,
car attacks, acid attacks. So, you know, crazy people are going to do what crazy people are going to do, frankly. And yeah, I mean, Miatta's, you know, your point about far-right extremism is interesting, but I think in this country, you know, things have been lanced. The boil has been lanced by the Brexit vote, and now by the delivery of a big majority Conservative government, immigration has actually fallen down people's list of priorities because they think that the publicity, you know, the public showing of taking control is enough for people to stop worrying so much about the immigrants all coming over. And that's really interesting since the referendum.
Come in.
Well, I'll say, and yet the front pages and the government's policy on immigration that sounds far more soundbite and rhetoric than substance suggests that the ball hasn't been launched on immigration. And actually what we're seeing, all the moves on the hostile environment, again, very, very worrying, I think incredibly irresponsible by the government. It's playing into a form of populism and is playing into a form of othering that is very dangerous.
Although we shouldn't be guilty, should we? Because for years, people who were concerned about immigration felt they didn't want to speak out about it because their concerns might be economic or, you know, they didn't want to be accused of being racist. And so there was a whole group of people who felt that their plight, working class people, actually, in the main, a lot of those say that's why they voted for Brexit, that felt that if they tried to speak out, they were accused of being racist. What do you make of the new system that was announced yesterday and some of the detail that's emerging from it? For instance, you know, there was talk, isn't there, of these sort of economically inactive Brits who would be able to suddenly come to the fore when there wasn't
8 million of them, apparently.
Yeah, but actually, when you look at it, they are primarily, according to various reports, this one in the Eye, carers, students, sick or retired, so not necessarily able to fill those jobs. And actually, the Home Secretary was called out. I think we've got a little clip of her talking to Nick Ferrari on LBC, was called out that actually her family probably wouldn't have been able to get in under the new system. Let's just have a look.
The side of my family on my father's side were in catering, so I don't know if I'd actually be in this country under these rules. Would you, with your parents?
This isn't about my background or my parents.
But it's interesting. Would you have qualified? Would your parents, I understand, came from Uganda and then were very successful in setting up news agents? They wouldn't have qualified, would they?
This is a very different system to what has gone on in the past. And don't forget, this is a points-based system based on the labour market. Yeah, but also let's not forget, Nick, we're not changing our approach to refugees and asylum seekers, which is very different to a points-based system for employment and that particular route.
But it's quite interesting, isn't it? I wouldn't be sitting in my studio and you wouldn't be Home Secretary of one of the biggest offices in the land under your system.
But the policies are changing. This is the point. We are changing our immigration policy, one that is fit for purpose for our economy, that is based on skills. This is not about refugees and asylum and people that are being persecuted around the world. We must differentiate between the two.
Well, Priti Patel got a history confused there. Her parents, when they would have arrived in the 60s, there was no refugee problem in Uganda at that time. It was a British protectorate, a British colony.
So she was suggesting they could...
And even when Idi Amin... So my family, my mother's side of the family, they came from Kenya, General Kenyatta in Kenya. And even then, they weren't considered refugees, they were immigrants. They were actually British citizens, but they were considered as immigrants. It wasn't a refugee scenario. But she's absolutely right. Nick Ferrari's like, my father came to this country in 1965, couldn't speak a word of English, but was brought in because they needed the labour. He was brought in, he learnt a skill, he learnt to drive a bus, and he drove a bus for 40 years. And I looked at him every morning, he looked smart in his tie and shirt, and I was like, God, yeah, great, he taught me about hard work. And if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here now. And in 1965, when he arrived, Enoch Powell had started to sort of send these whispers that we don't need these immigrants coming over here. Well, clearly they did, because they were advertising in Pakistan saying we need labour. So it feels like we're doing exactly the same thing now here.
It really does, and this does feel like a policy that will unravel, a policy that in, a month's time, 2 months' time, as we look at the detail, it will become clear that it is just a soundbite. They wanted something that said Australian point system rather than a substantive policy that can serve the economy and serve our society. And, you take one sector, so social care. We've got 122,000 shortages of workers in the social care sector. At the moment, 1 in 5 care workers are non-UK. If you stop that, our care sector, so these, this is looking after our elder parents or people who are going through the care system, would literally fall on its knees. And, the government hasn't really thought about that. The same with the construction sector.
They have given kind of, if you like, a nod and a wink, haven't they, that they'll review it and see how it goes. And they would argue they're responding to a group of people that did want to see immigration monitored, reduced, numbers brought down.
Well, the one thing I would say on this, so the problem with immigration, I think people are right to have legitimate concerns about immigration, particularly communities that have seen increased immigration or have seen their wages undercut by low-skilled migration or low-wage migration. That, for me, is not a problem of immigration, it's a failure of policy. Right. So when you're worried about the fact that your schools or your hospitals don't have enough places, that's a failure of policy. Why is the government not providing enough? Why is the government not regulating employers harder so that you can't undercut wages? So we've conflated the two things, and I feel the government isn't responding to the actual problem, they're responding in a populist way.
We could talk